All right, let's get started. In this webinar, we will cover 4 basic topics, and these topics are listed on the slide. We want to make sure that we cover the basics of the growth approach that we're using in Connecticut for our Smarter Balanced assessments. We will discuss what growth information is available on our data portal, EdSight. And if you're not familiar with EdSight, we'll walk you through it just to give you a sense of where the growth reports are located. We will share with you what additional growth data has been made available to districts already. And we will end with discussion about how these growth results are incorporated into the next generation accountability system for districts and schools. In the registration for this webinar, we did ask that you listen to the narrated PowerPoint presentation that was on our website. I hope that all of you, or at least almost all of you, have had a chance to do that. So I'm not going to repeat that entire presentation. But as a follow-up to this webinar, we will send you that link again and also send you this PowerPoint itself that we're using today so that you'll have that as a resource as well. So we will make sure we send that to you as well. So Connecticut's growth model is based on the Smarter Balanced vertical scale. It uses that vertical scale for the same student between 2 or more points in time. And given that we have just had 2 administrations of the Smarter Balanced assessment, it measures growth for the first results from 2014-15 to 2015-16. And because it's based on a vertical scale, we refer to it in this instance as a criterion-referenced growth model. The model provides ambitious yet achievable individual student targets, and these have been established, again, in English language arts and mathematics. The targets are based on a student's starting point, that is their vertical scale score in the first year of the growth measurement. So in this case, the starting year would be 2014-15. The model expects all students to grow, including those performing in achievement levels 3 and 4. And the growth data are reported in really 2 ways, and we will discuss that with examples so that we want to make sure everybody understands how the growth results are reported. We use 2 metrics. One is called the growth rate. The other one is called the average percentage of target achieved, and we will discuss that in detail. First, let's look at the growth table itself. This is the growth table for English language arts, and there is a similar growth table for mathematics. As you can see on this table, on the very top of the table are the 4 achievement levels for Smarter Balanced that have been divided into 8 categories, and we divided those categories based on the average standard errors for students at the achievement level cut points, and that's explained in the narrative PowerPoint presentation. But basically, based on a student's starting score in year 1, you know this table tells you how much growth in vertical scale score points that student must aim for by the end of the next grade. So let's take an example. Let's look at a 3rd grade student with a Smarter Balanced vertical scale score at the end of 3rd grade of 2,350. That student would be in this bucket, level 1, category high, and that student would be expected to grow 71 vertical scale score points by the end of grade 4. So So in that instance, the student with a score of 2,350, if they were to grow 71 scale score points, and if my math is correct, their expected score at the end of 4th grade would be 2,421, which would put that student into this bucket, as a result of which they would need to grow for the next cycle 69 scale score points from grade 4 to grade 5. Again, this is just an illustration. This is explained in detail in that narrated PowerPoint presentation. So it's really based on the starting point for a student as to how many scale score points they need to grow. This is the table for English Language Arts, and the table for mathematics in the subsequent slide looks very similar. And just to be clear here that these growth targets were developed based on the actual growth attained by Connecticut students from 2014-15 to 2015-16. So even though we're using the Smarter Balanced Assessments, which is a national consortium of assessments, this growth model is based on Connecticut's data and Connecticut students. Just want to be clear. And it's not a model that necessarily the consortium is prescribing or all other states are using. This is Connecticut's specific growth model for our students in our schools and districts. And again, if you have any questions as we go through this, please don't hesitate to send it through the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to respond to those. All right, now let's take a look at those two metrics, the growth rate and the average percentage of target achieved. This is an example, a hypothetical example of 4 students. You see them on the bottom of the chart, student 1, student 2, student 3, and student 4. And let's presume that these 4 students, all of them happen to be at the same level and have the same target of 60 scale score points. That's their target amount. And that's represented by the blue chart, the blue bar for each of those students. Now let's look at each student at a time here. Student 1, if that student from one grade to the next grows 42 scale score points, we would say that the student did not meet the target because they didn't achieve 60 points, but because the student gained 42 points out of the 60, we say that the percentage of target achieved is 70% for that particular student. So they didn't get all the way there, but they got 70% of the way there. So we want to recognize that growth that was achieved. Let's look at student 2. Student 2 achieved 60 scale score points, or grew 60 scale score points from one year to the next. This student did meet their target, so met target is yes. And the percentage of target achieved is 100. So in this case, student 2 achieved 100% of their target. Let's look at student 3. Same target of 60, but in this case, the student actually grew 66 scale score points. So obviously the student met the target, which is yes, but you'll notice in this case that the percent of target achieved is actually 110. So in this case, we're actually giving credit for growth above the target. Let's look at student 4 now. Student 4 is a little bit like student 1, did not hit the target, got 36 scale score points, and achieved 60% of the target. So the two metrics that we're reporting, growth rate and average percentage of target achieved, are calculated as follows in this example of 4 students. Students 2 and 3 met their targets, but student 1 and 4 did not meet their targets. So 2 out of 4 students met their target. So the growth rate is 50%, which is 2 out of 4 students. Now the average percentage of target achieved says it looks at the percent of target achieved by each student and then averages those percentages to say, actually the average percent of target achieved is 85% because 2 students either met or 1 student even exceeded their target, but the other 2 students who didn't meet their target actually made some headway towards that target. So we want to recognize and give credit for that growth. So the average percent of target achieved actually recognizes every point of growth that a student makes toward their growth target. The closer all students in a group, whether it be a school, a district, or a student group like English learners or students with disabilities, the closer that group of students is to their respective targets, the greater the average percentage of target achieved will be. So even though the growth rate is really a binary measure, it just says, did a student meet the target, yes or no, the average percentage says, how close are students on average to their individual targets? 2 important points before I leave this slide. One is that the, quote, extra credit, in this case student 3, is capped at 110%. So if student 3 had made, let's say, 100-point growth, their percent of target achieved will be capped at 110. And there's a reason for that, because if we didn't cap it, it really was skewing these averages greatly. So we capped it at 110%. The other important safeguard here is that some students, and a few students do this, let's say they actually regress from one year to the next and don't achieve a greater scale score in the second year, it's not like we're factoring negative growth into that average percentage of target achieved. We set that base at 0. So the percent of target achieved ranges from 0 to 110 for each at the student level. I hope that gives you a clear sense of the difference between the growth rate and the average percentage of target achieved. That is one of the common questions we receive from this growth model, so I just wanted to be clear that is what's happening there. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on that. All right, so that's how the growth model itself works, and there's a lot more. There's a lot more to it on the narrative PowerPoint, and we can answer particular questions that come through. I want to switch to the next aspect of the presentation, which is the delivery of the results through EdSight. As I mentioned, EdSight is our data portal for all education data, including assessment data. The website, the URL for EdSight is really EdSight, as you see spelled out on here, edsight.ct.gov. And you'll come to a page that looks like this. This page actually was updated today, so this month was updated this morning. To get to the growth reports, you need to click on or move your mouse over to the performance section on the menu on the top. When you do that, you will see a drop-down menu that will give you a list of items that is on the left side of the screen. It's this stuff. And then you'll need to click on Smarter Balanced. When you click on Smarter Balanced, you will see the actual achievement results for Smarter Balanced. And on the left-hand side of that page, you will see a link to the Smarter Balanced Growth Model. And if you click on that Smarter Balanced Growth Model, you will come to the actual growth model results, which will look something like this. The default for this page is the statewide growth results across all grades. Now remember, we're talking about students in grades 4 through 8 because the growth model needs a baseline year, so the 3rd grade serves as the baseline for 4th grade, so there's no 3rd grade growth results. It starts with 4th grade and then goes on up to grade 8. So it starts with the all grades combined selection. and then shows you statewide the number of math students, the growth rate, and the average percentage of target achieved. You know now that the growth rate represents what percent of the math students actually hit their target, and the average percent of target achieved represents, on average, how close are the math students to their respective targets. So the way to interpret this is 43.1% of the 185,000 students in ELA met their targets, and on average, they achieved 63.8% of their respective targets. Again, math results are also presented. Using the buttons on the top here, if you were to select all grades instead of all grades combined and then hit submit, the results would be disaggregated for each of the respective grades. And let's look at each of these selections a little bit here. So if you were to click all grades, it would give you every grade broken out for each of the grades. You can select one district or all districts from the district menu over here. You can select all schools from the school drop-down menu after you select a district. You can choose a subject from the subject drop-down menu, and the filter by gives you all our subgroup information. So it gives you results by race, ethnicity, gender, students with disabilities, free reduced price meal eligibility, and the 2-level and the 3-level are really, the 3-level breaks out free and reduced into 2 separate categories. You get the English learner status, and then you also get our high needs group, which is what's used for accountability purposes. The high needs group is a student is considered to be in the high needs group if they're either an English learner, a student with a disability, or a student eligible for free or reduced price meals. So once you make your selections here, you just click the blue submit button, and then the results will be generated on EdSight. So here's an example of how the results work. In this case, the selection is all districts, math, all grades, all students. And obviously it's not showing all districts, it's just a screenshot showing the first 3, but all other districts, if you were to run this on EdSight, you would get the entire state, every district listed individually. You notice this button up here, or this link up here, export to CSV. A CSV is a comma-separated value. It's simply, it's a format that's recognized by Excel, so if you were to click that, most likely in your system, it would just open the file in Excel, and you would be able to then do a lot of manipulations, sorting, filtering, whatever else you needed to do with the data. I know there are a couple of questions coming in, so please bear with us. Just want to run through the presentation, and we will answer those questions. I just want to make one point on this report that you see here. You notice this button or this metric that says gain here? This gain metric is actually the difference in average scale score between 2014-15 and 2015-16. This is not the growth rate or the average percent of target achieved. Because it's an average of the actual scale scores, this metric is displayed when you select an individual grade. In this case, we've selected all grades, so you are able to look at a vertical scale score for the matched students. But just know that this gain metric does include, because it's averaging the students, is students who make negative growth from one year to the next. That would be included in this gain metric. But we're simply reporting this to you for information. This metric is not used for accountability purposes, for school and district accountability. We are actually using this average percentage of target achieved. And the reasons for that I've already mentioned, which is we want to recognize all gain growth achieved by our students. Every point of growth matters in this system, so that's why we use this more precise measure of average percent of target achieved. This chart shows you, or this slide shows you the output that you would see in Excel if you were to do all districts, all students, what you saw in the prior selection. So in this case, you notice this actually starts at column C. So the district information would be in columns A and D. Then it gives you the school name, the grade, the number of math students, and everything here. So in Excel, you can filter, sort, select particular schools. You can do whatever you need to do with these data, manipulate it, analyze it in a whole different ways in Excel. The good thing about EdSight is any report on EdSight, any interactive report on EdSight, you can, and whatever result we generate based on your selection, you will always have that export link. So you can click export and dump it out to Excel and then do whatever you need to do with it. So I just wanted to share with you now some of the observations from the state perspective when we released these growth results in December, and what were some of our sort of key takeaways at the state level. There are many more things that you can dig into at your district and school levels. At the state level, we noticed that growth was stronger in the elementary grades, 3 to 4 and 4 to 5 for both subjects. And you know, we have some theories and rationales which I'm sure you will have as well. These are the students who have, for the most part, received Common Core aligned instruction from the outset, from kindergarten for the most part, and they're the ones that are more exposed to that content, and so are showing the greatest growth across the grades, across those early grades. We also see, and this is not illustrated on the slide, but when we do the subgroup information, we do see that growth gaps exist, and those gaps are more pronounced in middle school. So we see that in the data as well. So those were some of our sort of high-level observations that we wanted to sort of share with you here. And we also wanted to sort of pose some questions for you. We'll share with you sort of the student-level data that already has been provided to districts. That you can use or you can use some of the EdSight data to answer some of these types of questions. How do the district's growth results that, compare to state-level growth results by grade level? How is your district doing? Are you doing better than the state average? Not as good for each of the grades. Maybe you're doing better in some grades than others. Another question you could ask is, again, just as we did at the state level, is there any difference in growth across grades within schools in your district? How is one school doing compared to another, if you do have multiple schools? And again, with all of these questions, it's important to ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Why might one school do a little better than another? What are the actions that they're taking that are helping students grasp these concepts better? And again, variability across particular grades across schools, and again, asking the question why. In the student level data, we actually provided you with the starting category for each student. If you remember in the growth table, we talked about how there are 8 categories, 8 starting points for students that determine how much growth is expected. That information, that starting point, is actually included in the student level data that we provided to all districts. This was provided through PSIS for download, and that actually will enable you to answer this question, which is, how are students at different starting points in your schools growing? Are students at lower performing levels also growing compared to students at higher performing levels? Those are the kinds of questions you can kind of dig into at your own district and school level, and again, look at variability across schools, across grades. We chose not to include it at the state level only because the numbers of students becomes very small very quickly when you start to do that, and it becomes hard for us to present that information on a public portal. And lastly, the high needs group, I mentioned that as a group that's used for accountability. And how does the growth of high needs students in your district or in your school or in your particular grade compared to those in other districts or the entire state? Because if we are to close the achievement gap, Those are the students who need to grow and grow at a much faster rate in order to be able to close our achievement gaps. So that information is something you can dig into as well and see how our high need students in your schools and across the district growing compared to other districts or the state as a whole. I mentioned the student level data. The student level data file includes, for every student tested in your district in 2016, it includes the grade, subgroup membership. We also provide a flag for high needs. It includes the vertical scale scores from years 1 and 2. It includes the achievement levels from years 1 and 2. It includes those 8 categories I just mentioned. It includes the individual student target for each student. That's in that file that was provided. An indication of whether the student met the target, a yes, no, the amount of growth achieved, the percentage of growth target achieved, all of that information is included. Also included is 2 important flags in the data. And this is something that you should know in terms of how the results are included in your file here. A student is included in your district or school's report. Let's start with district. If that student who was enrolled in your district on October 1 of 2015 and tested in your district in the springtime. So only if they're in the same district on October 1 and at the time of testing is that student actually included for growth calculations. The rationale being that you have the student for the year and received instruction in your district, so it's fair to hold the district accountable for the growth of that student. Now, this is not a new rule. This rule exists with indicator 1 as well of our accountability system, which is the achievement, the SPI, DPI. It's the same rule that's in place there as well. The same rule is also applied at a school level. Was the student in the same school on October 1 of 2015 and at the time of testing, to make sure that a school is held accountable only if the student is found in that same school at both those points in time. So it's possible that a student may have moved within the district from one school to another. So in that case, the student may not be held accountable at a school level, but would be held accountable at the district level because they're in the same district. So those safeguards in the data are not new. They're being applied to the growth results as well, and they are in the student level data. There are, on EdSight, there are also a couple of other growth resources available in the data itself. One has to do with, and they're on the left side, and I know there was a question about, is there a document that defines all these terms like gain, the APTA, the average percent of target achieved, et cetera. And if you notice on EdSight, there's something called a technical report. I'm going to bring my thick green pen to play here. This technical report is that document that contains the technical information and the definition for a lot of these things. There is a narrated PowerPoint presentation. There is a presentation without the narration. And then there are a couple of other points that are the data visualizations. And let's take a quick look at those. And you have to hover over that on the mouse, and then you'll see those 2 options, ELA and math. And we will show you the ELA as an example here. And we're sort of trying out some of these visualizations to present the data in different ways so that people can have different ways of understanding the information. And in the coming months and years, you'll see more of these appearing on EdSight. So what this chart shows is the growth achieved by a district, the average percent of target achieved for all students. That's the y-axis. But in terms of the x-axis, this actually says what is the percent of high-need students in that district. So it really juxtaposes the composition of a district in terms of the percentage of their high-need students with the growth that's achieved by all students. So what this says is, so if you look at, and you notice the variability, So if you look at the 20% bar on the x-axis, it says there's a whole bunch of districts here in this part of the distribution. Let me pull up right here, who have around 20% of their students are high needs, but you notice how that some districts have average growth rates, I'm sorry, not growth rates, average percent of target achieved of around 50–55%, but then there are other districts that are around 80% average percent of target achieved for all their students. So these districts have similar compositions in terms of the percent of high need students in their districts, but are achieving very different growth results. So that's what this chart is trying to illustrate. On EdSight, if you actually go to the live site and you move your mouse onto these particular dots, it will actually show you the name of the district. So you can actually see that sort of by moving your mouse on there. The last piece of this presentation has to do with how will growth results be incorporated into accountability and when. The answer to when is now. We're in the midst of finalizing these growth results, and I know that's the question that's come up. We're in the midst of finalizing the accountability results. The growth results obviously are finalized and posted. Growth is indicator 2 of our accountability system, and we measure for accountability purposes, we look at the growth achieved by all students and the high needs group. And what you'll see as a result in the model is that growth carries more weight in the model than does achievement. So let me illustrate that with this example report, and the report that districts will receive very shortly, and we're talking hopefully in the next couple of weeks, districts receiving some of these results, receiving these accountability results. And here's an example. You'll notice that new rows are appearing in the report for ELA growth, all students, ELA growth, high need students, and math, all students, and math, high need students. And you'll notice that each of those buckets carries 100 points in the system, and that the max points for indicator 1, which is achievement, which is the SPI, has been cut in half to 50 points. So growth will carry more points in the system in total, because this will add up to 300 and this will add up to 400. If a school or district doesn't have a particular subgroup, then those points are not factored in. That particular line of the accountability report would be not applicable. And lastly, this is the last slide, we do believe that growth, by measuring growth, we are doing the right thing and looking at not just who a school or district has, but how the students they have, regardless of their starting point, how they're growing from one grade to the next during that school year. Because that is a much better reflection of the efforts of the educators and the leaders in that district and school from an instructional standpoint, and it's really measuring the growth that those students are achieving, and it's a more accurate way of reflecting the efforts of those educators. So I hope this presentation has given you a sense of how our growth model is built, but also how you can access the results and how to interpret the results and understand the results. We encourage you to use that student level data to conduct more analyses, or even start with EdSight if you haven't gotten the student level data. There's a lot of ways you can slice and dice the EdSight data to get at it, export the data to Excel, look at how you're doing relative to other districts or other schools, look at how you're doing relative to the state, identify where there might be areas that you may want to focus on for either this year or the coming year, and hopefully this presentation has given you some added information. And now I'm going to switch to some of the questions that we received prior to this presentation and also during the presentation. Let me see here. One of the questions has to do with English learners and students with disabilities. When they exit the group, whether they are counted back into the group. And here I will differentiate how this is handled for indicator 1, which is the SPI, DPI versus growth. So for growth calculations, we are not including exited Ls. We are only including current Ls, or current students with disabilities. So if they were previously students with disabilities last year, but in growth, in the second year of growth, they're not a student with a disability, then they're not part of that subgroup. It only includes those who were a student with disability or an L at the time of testing in the second year of the growth model. And that's intentional in the sense that we want to ensure that we are focusing the growth indicator on those students who are currently in those subgroups, because we want them to grow at a faster rate and exit those subgroups. For indicator 1, however, we do include former Ls and former students with disabilities back into the subgroup, because there the measurement is about the achievement. And if a school or district has done the effort of accelerating the student's growth and helping the student exit that particular subgroup, then we think it's appropriate for those exited students to be counted back into that particular subgroup for measurement of achievement. For ELs and students with disabilities, that currently is done for up to 2 years after exit. With the new federal law under EdSight, those rules change a little bit, and we'll discuss that at a future date. But currently, for English learners and students with disabilities, we count them back in those subgroups for up to 2 years for the SPI, DPI indicator 1 achievement, but not for growth. Just want to be clear about that. That was one of the questions we received. Let me now go through some of the other questions here. This is an interesting one. Why can't access to student-level growth data come through EdSight? Will it continue to come from CSDE? EdSight was built by CSDE staff. It is entirely homegrown, with Performance Office staff actually building it from the ground up with support from the Sachs Institute. And in the future, you will receive secure access to EdSight and be able to get at your student level data through EdSight. There's a question here about if a student moves from elementary to middle. I'm not sure what the question is trying to get at, but in the context of growth, let's say you have a K-5 school, elementary school, and a 6-8 middle school. A student who goes from 5th grade to 6th grade is held accountable for growth in 6th grade at the middle school. Their starting score will be their Smarter Balance score from 5th grade in the elementary school. And that also raises an interesting question, because when you look at the data on EdSight, and perhaps even within your own districts, another question I'd urge you to look at is, how do students grow in the first year of transition to a new school? And your grade configurations are all different in your districts. But if you have a K-5 to a 6-8, or a K-6 and a 7-8 middle school, or a K-3 and a 4-5 and a 6-8, whatever configuration you have, I'd encourage you to look, and this you can do just on EdSight, but you can also do it with your student level data. How do students grow in the first year of transition? And this is something we're looking at even in our data, to see how those transitions impact those students. And I think our tentative preliminary analysis indicates that that first year is often the year of least growth. And I'd be interested in your thoughts from your own analyses as well. Please do reach out to us with some of your observations. And there's another question, but I'm not sure I follow this question. It talks about, are we responsible at middle school for the 6th grader entering or the 8th grader going to high school? Let me just answer in a way I think I'm understanding it. If it's a middle school, a 6-8 middle school, the 6-8 middle school will be held accountable for the growth of the 8th grader from 7th to 8th grade. Because we don't have, there's no continuity for the Smarter Balance beyond 8th grade, we don't have a way of measuring growth into high school currently. And one other question we had is, what is the ultimate target in accountability for growth? And in that, in the Excel, in this sample district report for 15-16, you will notice that the ultimate target is 100. The points are 100 and the target is 100. What that means is that we expect that the average percentage of target achieved for all students or the high need students for ELA and math, on average, it'll be 100. And the reason that's set at 100 is that we expect, obviously, all students to grow and hit their targets in a year, but also the fact that the average percent of target achieved gives credit a little bit above the target. So it gives credit up to 10% above the target. So it expects, on average, that that average percent of target achieved will be 100. So if you look at the state results, for example, you'll see that our average was 63, but only 43% of students actually met their targets. So, and you'll see that when you look at other district results too. There will be cases where there are schools in the state that are over 90% in terms of the average percent of target achieved, and the percent of students meeting their target, the growth rate might be 75%. So not all students hit their target, but on average, most of them that even didn't hit their target were actually pretty close to their target, so that the average was over 90%. So that's why this particular expectation for growth is set at 100%, because we're incenting growth above the target and giving credit a little bit above 100%. So on average, we expect this to be at 100. I noticed that some folks have put questions in another spot. I'm getting to it. Please bear with me. There's a question about, is there an average percentage growth represented by the targets? I mentioned it in the narrated PowerPoint, but I'll clarify it here too. Those targets that you saw in that table for ELA and math, those individual student growth targets, are the targets achieved by the 60th percentile of growers. So what that means is, we looked at the growth achieved by Connecticut students from 14-15 to 15-16 in each of those buckets within each of those grades, so within each of those categories. So at different points on the vertical scale, based on their starting score, we looked at what kind of growth, what amount of growth they achieved. And that value that we selected as the growth target is the growth achieved by the 60th percentile student. So that represents slightly above average growth. And if you listen to that growth model, the narrative presentation, we get into the criteria that we use to pick those targets. We wanted those targets to be ambitious in that they actually help students get to higher levels of achievement in future years, but we wanted those targets to also be achievable, because we wanted to know that that our students and our schools and our districts can actually achieve those targets. So that's why kind of it was picked at that. And we also wanted to, importantly, make sure that those targets were considering the measurement error that exists between when we're looking at two test scores. And so we set those targets to sort of in consideration of all those three factors, which is the measurement error, the actual growth achieved, and and the fact that districts can actually achieve it. So we want to make sure that the targets were ambitious, but also achievable. So that's where those sort of targets actually represent. Looking at the next question here. Will the state provide a report that Converge calculates the expected amount of growth for each student, or will districts and staff have to do the converting on their own? It's a good question. It is something we could provide based on the ending score from year one, so that at the start of the next year you have a sense of what the individual growth targets are. But I just want to be clear about one point. A, we're not going to be including these individual growth targets in a student level report or anything. This growth target is really more of a school and district accountability expectation. Clearly, at a student level, your intervention targets might be much more aggressive for particular students. This is really designed more from a school and district accountability perspective. But from that perspective, I could see we could check into the possibility of providing this to you. We could also provide tables that actually map each score range to a particular target that you could, your data folks could join to your student level results and generate these targets. But alternatively, we could consider providing this as well. There's another question that says, will the EdSight data portal continue to report % of students in each level, as well as growth model in coming years? The answer to that is yes. We're actually doing a few different ways of reporting here. We are obviously doing the level 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 3 and 4 combined. We'll continue to do that. But those reports really represent who tested in your district. It doesn't factor into the fact that whether the student was also in your district on October 1. Those calculations are not included when we report those level 1, 2, 3, 4 results. That's really just a statement saying, okay, who tested in your district, here's the results. It's only when we get to the SPI, DPI, or the growth model calculations are when we're sort of implying those, what I'll call accountability rules. Because that's when we want to make sure that we're being even more judicious and careful and thoughtful about these sorts of rules to make sure that when we generate those accountability results, that we've applied these safeguards. So the federal rules actually expect us to do both. So both those calculations will continue. Is the gain calculated from a matched cohort of students or simply the average from one year to the next within a school? The average for a school for both those years actually is the average of the matched cohort. So it does represent the average of the matched cohort. So it's really the same thing in effect. So if we show a matched cohort of 120 students and we show you an average scale score, that average scale score actually pertains to the students who are part of that matched cohort. If student took tests last 2 years and takes FB in 2017, will all scores appear? All 3 scores appear. At this point, and we received another question similar to this from another person, which talked about multi-year growth. At this point, we want to take it 1 year at a time. This is an annual growth model. We were able to implement this model really thanks to our folks here, our psychometricians here, and our technical advisory committee that was able to advise us every step of the way with 2 years of data. So once we have the 2017 data, obviously we will look at, A, how our growth targets are doing and how our students progressing across multiple years. But at this point, there is no move to sort of look at a multi-year growth model. This is an annual growth model. We're testing annually, and we want to make sure that students are growing at least, making at least 1 year's worth of growth in the year, hopefully more, for some of our historically underperforming students. So at this point, it is an annual model, but we will be looking at the 2017 and potentially the 2018 results as well. I want to clarify one other point, and this is in the narrative presentation as well, that the targets that we've established, we're not going to move those targets for at least 3 cycles. So we set, I mentioned the 60th percentile was the basis for setting this target. So, but it's not like next year now we're going to say, okay, the targets have changed. Here's where the 60th percentile is, and so it's a new set of targets. No, these targets are criterion targets. There are fixed standards that we will hold for at least 3 cycles. So you know what the targets are. They're going to hold for 3 cycles. We've had 1 cycle. We're going to have another cycle at the end of this year, and then we'll go through 1 more cycle. At a minimum, we'll hold it for those 3 cycles, and then reevaluate to see if there's any need to reset those targets. What happens with the student who is scoring at the upper end? They can only grow so far. That's true, but I'll point 2 things. One is with the Smarter Balanced, given that it's a computer adaptive assessment, and given that there are, I'll use simple language, hard items in all grades, we are actually seeing pretty good standard errors of measurement even for our highest functioning students. So while in our legacy assessments we might have had a lot of students just topping out and not being able to show any growth, with Smarter Balance, actually the test is actually doing really well even for our highest achieving students. That's kind of point number 1, just to make the point that precision of measurement is good. The second point is that if you look on the table, the growth table, and I'm going to try to sort of circle back to that growth table here. If you notice on this growth table, for our highest students in the highest category in a particular year, in a particular grade, if their starting point is at category 8, highest point of level 4, then we do have a target amount, but we also have this text that says maintain. What that means is that our expectation for these students who fall into this highest bucket is that they either grow 44 points or that they function in the same highest grade bucket in the next grade. So that's our way of allowing those students to show growth or get credit for growth as long as they remain in that highest level of achievement in the next grade. And like I said, that students at this level, the test actually is doing pretty well in terms of precision of measurement. I don't see any other questions. I think that, I'm sorry, there's a lot of questions and a lot of things coming in. I think I've done my best to answer everything that's come in. If I've missed anything, my apologies. Let's see. And if I missed anything, my apologies. If there's any other questions, we will take it up off the record, so to speak, and respond to you privately. We're at the top of the hour here, and I just want to say thank you so much for your patience and for joining this webinar. We have recorded it, and if it holds merit and if it's usable, we will post it. Again, I encourage you to go to our website and look up, or go to EdSight, play with the data, use the narrated PowerPoint, use the visualizations, or just look at the EdSight reports, break it out, use the demographic breakouts, the filter bys to do it, and export the data to Excel. Look at how you're doing compared to other districts, compared to the state, and most importantly, continue to keep asking these questions, because ultimately I think we're all in this together. We want our students to grow, and I think using growth data rather than achievement data, I think, has the potential to give us a little bit better information about the work that we're doing and how we can do it better. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful weekend.